talk about some of these major groups, the ones that have some, but not a lot, of cultivated members, cultivated and characterized. And so let's start with verrucomicrobia, because this is a really big group of organisms, even compared to some of the ones we've talked about before. Verrucomicrobium itself is in this group, Prosticobacter. A lot of these organisms have appendages, stalks or multiple stalks, this sort of a thing, such as those two. The rest of these aren't very well characterized, and you notice there's a bunch of uncultured sequences that I've included in here. These organisms are probably generally related to planktomycetes. And chlamydia. And they're generally found in aquatic and soil environments. So here's Verrucomicrobium spinosa. Typically rod-shaped organism. There's usually an appendage at one end and then a series of them all around the surface. And these appendages are covered in fimbriae that are used to attach to the environment. Probably the function of these appendages is just to increase the surface area of the cells. These cells tend to be small, and small cells have a low surface area to volume ratio, right? And one way to increase that surface area, which gives you more exposure to the environment and its nutrients, is to change your shape and protrude these appendages. And that's probably what's going on in here. Here's Prosticobacter fusiformis. This thing was originally thought to be an alpha proteobacterium. And there used to be, Prosticobacter, they're members of this genus that are actually alpha proteobacteria and have been moved over to that group because morphologically they're hard to tell apart. But here you have a generally ovoid cell with a stalk on it. Looks a little bit like Colobacter, right? But these don't have that biphasic lysoform where you have swarmer cells versus stalk cells. They're all stalked. There's no budding here. It goes through basically a fission. Here's Opitutus teres. This is a heterotroph. It's got a flagellum. Unusual, cocci don't usually have flagellum, right? That's a terrible shape to push through the water. But these do. And amongst the bacteria, it's unusual for cocci to have flagellum. They're really, really small. They're right on the edge of your ability to see them under a microscope. And for a long time, this was the smallest known bacterial organism. It used to be called Ultramicrococcus for the formal name, for Ultramicrobium. Oftentimes these things form short chains, and people thought of them as rod-shaped cells until they could get a higher resolution microscopic view of them. This comes from soil. Here's another one of these big phylogenetic groups, Acidobacteria. These things are quite common in soil. They can make up, in some cases, a pretty significant fraction of the organisms in soil, particularly in, as you might imagine, acidic soil. What are some acidic soils that you could think of? Pretty much anything in North Carolina to start with, right? Anything you see a lot of pine trees or, I can't think of the flowers, but they're soils in North Carolina and the East Coast generally tend to be fairly acidic. But there are a lot more acidic environments than that, and these are primarily peat bogs of various forms. And these organisms are quite common. And if you look at the uncharacterized organisms, you see a lot of soil, and most of these are acidic soils. You also see some subterranean sequences, hydrocarbon seeps, that sort of a thing. Acidobacterium capsulatum is the only one of these that's been studied in any great detail, isolated from what many people call pollution's worst case scenario, acid mine drainage. You guys know about acid mine drainage? Yeah. So when you mine, coal is the usual culprit, but it can be other metals, other things as well. It turns out that coal deposits are associated with phosphate deposits. And so when you mine coal, you get a lot of phosphate. And the good coal, you load onto train cars and you ship it off somewhere to burn it. But the coal that's not economically useful, you leave in piles, which are called tailings. these cold tailings get rained on, and all the stuff leaches out of it, including the phosphate, down into the groundwater. Oftentimes they're struck by lightning and start to smolder, and they burn forever. There are places, there's a place in Indiana that I visited years ago that, as far as anyone can remember, it has always been burned. And you see smoke coming up out of the ground just all the time. Water that comes out of these burning coal refuse piles is acid mine drainage. The pH is really bad. It's full of iron. It's full of phosphate. The pH is terrible. It's the pH that leaches all these toxic metals out of the ore, and you get all kinds of really terrible results of that. They're an ecological disaster. All that stuff flows into the water system, and it's awful. But there are organisms found in those acid mine drainage environments that are unique that you don't find in other places, and Acidobacterium capsulatum is one of them. You also see it in peat bogs. The group Nitrospira and relatives. How many of you guys keep aquariums? Anybody? No. You probably have heard, though, that when you start an aquarium, you always set it up and you let it run for a while before you put a lot of stuff in it. And the reason for this is you have to establish a nitrogen cycle. Fish excrete urea or ammonia, and that's pretty toxic to fish. And so you have to have organisms growing in that aquarium filtration system that oxidize that ammonia to nitrite and then to nitrate, and if you're doing it properly, ultimately to dinitrogen gas. The organisms in that nitrogen cycle include Nitrospiral. It's one of the really important ones. But this is not a common phenotype in this group. Sure, there are nitrogen oxidizers here, but there's also things like magneto bacterium, thermodesulfovibrio. This is a high temperature sulfate reducer. The magneto bacteria, I think, are really cool. But here's Nitrospira marina. This shows up in saltwater fish tanks all the time. Really tight helical organism, usually under a microscope. This looks like a rod because they're pretty small. This is a micron right here, so this looks like a short rod under a light microscope. Leptospirillum, this is an iron oxidizer, also found in acid mine drainage. But here's magnetobacterium. Most magnetobacteria are alpha proteobacteria. This one is unusual. Magnetobacteria are really cool. This is a little string of magnetite beads inside the periplasm of this organism. And so these are beads, these are magnetic beads, and of course as they link together end on end, all the positives are pointed one direction and all the negatives another. This is a compass needle. And so these organisms, the ones in the northern hemisphere have a flagellum on the south end of their magnetic needle, and they swim north. And the ones in the southern hemisphere do the opposite. Why would you want to do that? This is like the Dr. Seuss story, right? North-going sneetches and south-going sneetches. Why would you do that? Why would a bacterium want to swim north versus south? It's not going to the North Pole. Do the magnetic lines of the Earth actually go north and south? Not quite. This magnetic declination, that's one thing. But remember that the Earth isn't flat. The Earth is spherical, more or less. And so here's the core. The magnetic field lines go like that. So if you're in the northern hemisphere and you want to go north, you're also going down. These organisms are aquatic anaerobes. And so down is also down to the sediment. That's where they want to be. You can enrich for these organisms really easily. We used to do this in the micro lab. You take a nice, awful sediment like the ones you brought into class, and you put a magnet up against it. And you look for a white haze collecting at the North Pole after about a week. So it's really cool. You can't grow hardly any of these things. And biotechnologically, we can't make magnetite beads that small. If we could, hard disk would have almost infinite storage capacity. So there's a lot of interest in how these things create such small magnetic particles. Fusobacterium is another one of these big groups. Fusobacterium itself is the only one that's really very well characterized. It's a symbiont. You have it in your teeth. It's one of the first colonizing organisms when you're a baby and your teeth erupt. Fusobacterium and Villanella are the two kind of first colonizers of the surface, and they're a major component of your teeth throughout life. We also talked about Fusobacterium. So here's a picture of that symbiosis. Villanella is a coccus. Fusobacterium is a long rod. We also talked about Fusobacterium in terms of the chlorogene consortium, right, as a member of that organism in the middle, in some cases. And there's a bunch of other of these groups where there's a few characterized species, maybe one, maybe a couple of others that have been named but not really well characterized. And I'm not going to go through these. You could extend this list probably as long as you wanted.